Okay, it's 7 o'clock, so let's get started. Good evening, everyone. My name is John Moser. I am professor of history as well as co-chair of the Master of Arts in American History and Government program here at Ashland University. I'd like to welcome you all to Documents in Detail. This is Teaching American History Org's newest webinar series, and in each episode, we're going to do a deep dive into a single document discussing the historical, literary, and rhetorical aspects of it, while also analyzing the document's impact on American history, people, and thought. TeachingAmericanHistory.org is a project of the Ashbrook Center, a nonpartisan nonprofit based at Ashland University. We provide a variety of programs and resources for teachers of American history, government, and civics, all based on primary documents. In the next week, you will receive an email with a link to request a certificate of participation, as well as a link to the archived video and audio from today's program. To help us begin to think about the topics of this year's webinars, we are drawing speeches, letters, and writings from the Ashbrook Center's extensive document database, which is available at tah.org. You can participate in the discussion by typing your question into the chat window at the bottom of your screen at any time. The subject of today's program is Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural address, and to help discuss it, we hope we are going to have two speakers, Dr. Joseph Fornieri, professor of political science at Rochester Institute of Technology, although he's not here quite yet, and Dr. Eric Sands, associate professor of government at Berry College. So we hope that Professor Fornieri will join us whenever he gets here, but there's no reason why we shouldn't just jump into the material. Dr. Sands, how are you this evening?
Doing well. How are you?
I'm terrific. Thank you very much. Well, I was doing some poking around into the second inaugural. This is not my major area of expertise at all, and read it over and read over all the documents for this evening's event. And first of all, I'm struck by how brief the second inaugural is. I find, however, that it is only the third briefest of the inaugural addresses. The briefest was George Washington's second inaugural, and the second shortest was Franklin Roosevelt's fourth inaugural. So it does not, even though it is very brief, it does not have the distinction of being the briefest or even the second briefest. What then is so important about the second inaugural address of Abraham Lincoln that deserves our attention tonight?
Friends, can you hear me? I'm sorry. Am I here?
I can hear you fine, Joe.
And I apologize. I had some problem connecting. I have another MAG class at 8:15, so I'm going to have to cut out a little early.
Okay.
But is my audio okay?
Your audio sounds just fine.
Okay, I've been having problems with it lately. So again, please, I'm sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
We just got started. I only threw out a very introductory question. What is so important about Lincoln's second inaugural that it merits our attention this evening?
Does someone want to go?
Either one of you, feel free to jump in on that.
I'll start. I think it's, it can rightfully be considered one of Lincoln's greatest speeches. And for me, its greatness consists in the theological vision that is put forth and how Lincoln recognizes the role of divine providence in human affairs through this cataclysm of civil war, and yet at the same time resist the temptation to identify his will or the human will with the divine will. That's quite remarkable. We have to remember that this was a highly religious culture at the time that had been formed by the Second Great Awakening, and that each side was invoking the divine to justify its own interpretation of the war, its own interpretation of slavery. Lincoln's uh, depth of mind leads him to contemplate really the overarching meaning of this conflict. And it certainly was dissatisfying to some, as he says to um, the journalist there, Noah Brooks, that some are not flattered by being shown that there's a difference between the human and the divine will. So one could look at this speech, in terms of its rhetoric, and I don't mean rhetoric in a pejorative sense. The biblical language and symbolism and imagery that's woven into it, but also for me in terms of its content, and finally kind of relying upon invoking the higher power in faith to heal the nation's wounds. And finally, I see this as an expression. For me, it's interesting because I do see it as expression, as Reinhold Niebuhr did, of Lincoln's living faith. I think there's a remarkable continuity between the public expression of Lincoln's faith in this address and some of the private expressions of his faith. For example, in what's been known as the Meditation on the Divine Will that was discovered in his manuscripts. I'm sorry, I think it is. And it was in one of his notebooks after his death. So I've said quite a bit there. I know it's a lot to chew on. I want to give everybody an opportunity to talk. So that's I'll just start off. Thank you.
Okay, Professor Sands, what would you care to add?
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I'd add to that, and I mean, those are all great reflections on the significance of the speech. I mean, the other thing I'd point out is there's nothing else like it in American history. I mean, this is just a singularly unique speech that's given here. It's certainly more analogous to a sermon than it is to a speech in its own right. Lincoln invoking the Bible and quoting from the Bible directly. Certainly, a number of presidents had invoked the name of God in their speeches prior to Lincoln delivering this one, but only one president had ever directly quoted from the Bible, and that had been John Quincy Adams. And not in a way that we would talk about as being significant in the way that Lincoln does. So again, this is just so exceptional, and as a lot of times my students point out, they can't imagine a president delivering a speech like this today. It would just be inconceivable for a president to try to speak in this type of language, to try to address the nation in this kind of way. So the fact that Lincoln is able to do that with again a very different kind of audience in the 19th century than we've got in the 20th. There's just a lot that is very remarkable and very unique about what Lincoln attempted to accomplish, and I think did accomplish in the speech overall.
Well, both of you have mentioned this as a reflection of Lincoln's faith, and this gets to a question that I had, and also one of our viewers has asked: to what extent is this reflective of a personal religious transformation that Lincoln underwent during the Civil War? We know that earlier in his career he was not a particularly religious person. But certainly we find it front and center here. What sort of religious transformation did we see going on in Lincoln?
That's a great question. Eric, I just want to say hello. It's great to see you. Miss you. We need to keep in better touch.
Yes, indeed.
My brother. Are you in Georgia right now?
Yes.
All right. Give my best to Peter Lawler.
I will do so.
We'll be in touch. That is a great question. It's a question that I think has led to a lot of controversy. There are those kind of present a rival interpretation. There are those who think that Lincoln's invocation of religion, especially in this address, was simply for political utility. Now, certainly religion can be useful in politics. And statesmen throughout human history have invoked religion to buttress their cause or to buttress political and moral stances here. But I would disagree with that. I think that it's not only is it useful in the sense where it appeals to charity and a higher power. Useful doesn't necessarily mean untrue, but I think it is an expression of that living faith, which I think, I cannot point to a moment where Lincoln had, we can document some conversion experience. He, I think, inclined towards skepticism in his youth. Had written a book on skepticism. I'm persuaded of that. He would taunt the frontier preachers, but in my judgment, the man was always a seeker, and as his wife mentioned, religious by nature. And I think there was a deepening, perhaps through the suffering caused by the war, his own existential quest for meaning in view of that suffering. But there was some foundation, right? He had read the Bible. He had engaged in dialogue with uh, a a preacher who wrote a book on reconciling the miracles in the Bible with reason. James Smith was his name. Lincoln had read his work after the death of his first son when they were in Illinois. So I think that there was a deepening, and there's evidence to support that. For example, his the religious nature of his writings, um, his attendance at New York Avenue Presbyterian Church with Phineas Phineas Gurney, and the fact that one thing, Ron White has written a beautiful book on the Second Inaugural that I encourage everyone to read. It's called Lincoln's Greatest Speech. I think it's a beautiful work, and I'd encourage you. It's a great read. He does justice to the work, but he has been able to show that Lincoln attended private prayer services there, that he was in a would go there on a consistent basis in a private room and pray where no one could see him. So I think I guess I would use the word that there was a deepening of this faith during the war, perhaps because of the suffering, the death of his son. These are the experiences that really they can lead us to atheism, they could lead us to despair, or they could lead us to the soul's opening and for meaning, in quest for meaning in a much more poignant manner. And I think that's what happened with Lincoln.
Okay, Professor Sands.
Yeah, what I'd add to that is I think there's that old saying that no one is an atheist in a foxhole. And I'd add to that I don't think anybody's really an atheist who has to order men into foxholes. And that's
an interesting point. Yeah,
that's what Lincoln is doing during the war. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of casualties, and Lincoln has to bear the moral weight of all of that. That's crushing, without some sort of an outlet, without some way of putting that into context and helping him to understand what the purpose and the reason for all of this is. And that's why, Joe, when you bring up the meditation on divine will, I mean, I think that's a really significant document.
yes.
Because Lincoln didn't intend that to be read by anybody. This was something he wrote for himself. And a lot of the themes of the Second Inaugural show up in that meditation on divine will, talking about how
Yes.
God can't be for and against the same side. God may have his own purposes. This thing might be bigger than both of us. And I think we see, even in 1862, when he's writing this, that Lincoln is maybe not undergoing a religious conversion, but is maybe deepening in his faith, deepening in his understanding of the religious context of the war and in God's role in human affairs. And I think that's one of the reasons this comes across so clearly by the time we get to the second inaugural, is a lot of his thinking on this has crystallized at that point.
Yeah, that's well put. I think I like the word crystallized. I call it the culmination of his political faith.
Yeah.
Just a point, Eric, to add to what you say, it's often overlooked, and I don't understand why, that Lincoln's secretaries, Nicolay and Hay, when they published their massive biography on him, they included this. They were the ones that discovered this after his death, and they included it in their biography is to refute Herndon's, or at least an extreme version of Herndon's claim that Lincoln was an atheist. Saying that, and they say that this was not, they actually use the word exoteric. This was not simply an exoteric utterance that was done to accommodate the religious prejudices of the nation. This was done in the sincere. Here, let me find the passage. Do you guys mind?
Okay. Joe, is there any chance we could get you on camera?
I'm so embarrassed, you guys. Are you kidding me? I thought I was on camera. I'm sorry. How do I get on camera?
There's probably a little icon that you press that looks like the camera.
I'm so hopeless.
And we'll get in the video. You see it? There we go.
I apologize to everybody again.
Okay.
I thought I was on camera. This is why I stick to acoustic guitar and mandolin instead of electric. Yeah, let me just quickly read this quote if you get a chance. Please go ahead. I'll track it down in a second.
We have another question about how the address was received. Larry Fata asks, what did Republican circles think about the fact that Lincoln said that the North also deserved punishment from God for the sin of slavery? Was this a controversial statement?
Eric, do you want to field that?
Yeah. It depends on which Republicans you're talking about. Sort of moderate Republicans reacted to the speech in a fairly positive way. Newspapers reported on it quite positively. There wasn't really any sense that Lincoln had betrayed the country. In fact, if anything, there was a sense that the speech put on display Lincoln's supreme mercy. That the fact he was willing to withhold judgment, that he was not giving into vindictiveness, was all quite positive. Radical Republicans took a very different view on it. Radicals wanted to punish the South for the war and did not react to the speech particularly positively. Most of them were actually quite concerned about what this what was going to happen in the future in terms of Lincoln's Reconstruction policy, based on this speech that seemed to spread a spirit of reconciliation and binding up the nation's wounds and charity for all. This wasn't language that the radicals were particularly excited about. Democrats, just on the other side, weren't terribly enamored with the speech at all, but that wasn't really a surprise at the time.
Go ahead, Joe.
Henry Ward Beecher, who was one of the luminaries at the time as a preacher, delivered a speech around the same time at Fort Sumter. And so you get a sense of the contrast between Lincoln's second inaugural and the civil theology in that speech to what some of the fire and brimstone preachers of the North were saying, but renowned. Beecher says, I charge the whole guilt of this war upon the ambitious, educated, plotting political leaders of the South. They have shed this ocean of blood. A day will come when God will reveal judgment and arraign at his bar these mighty miscreants. And from 1,000 battlefields shall rise up armies of airy witnesses who with the memory of their awful suffering shall confront these miscreants with shrieks of fierce accusation, and every pale and starved prisoner shall raise his skinny hand in judgment. Blood shall cry out for vengeance, and tears shall plead for justice, and grief shall silently beckon, and love and heart smitten shall wail for justice. And in the end, he says that it shall be whirled aloft and plunged. They shall be whirled aloft and plunged downward forever and forever in an endless retribution, while God shall say, "Thus shall it be to all who betray their country." Very, very, quite a contrast.
I should say.
Right.
Well, this leads to a bit of a counterfactual question from Brian Evans. Let me find it now. Oh, yeah. If Lincoln had lived, do you think that he would have been impeached, or would he have handled the radical Republicans more successfully than Andrew Johnson did?
It's a great question.
And it's the beauty of counterfactual questions. You can't be wrong.
Yeah, I have no problem with counterfactual questions as a political scientist. So I think I know some historians are troubled by them. But I nothing wrong with speculation, as long as you make an argument one way or the other. But I'm going to throw this on there. I would like to think. No, I would like to think that Lincoln would have, part of his greatness was the ability to build a consensus, as with the border states, and certainly Reconstruction would have presented new challenges, but given the character of Lincoln's statesmanship and his political prudence, the ability to apply moral principle under circumstances, and his firmness, yet at the same time flexibility, I think he would have avoided impeachment, and perhaps Reconstruction could have been more successful with less of a bitter taste. But as I read the history of Reconstruction and over the many years, I see the rectitude of the radicals' cause, at least in principle. It was something I've kind of switched my position on over the years. I was much more, sympathetic to the moderates, but I think that extreme measures were required given what was occurring.
Okay, Eric.
Yeah, I think Lincoln would have very likely navigated those waters. I mean, one of the things we have to remember is that the radicals' numbers are not overwhelming in 1864.
Good point. Yeah.
One of the things that bolsters their numbers significantly is Andrew Johnson. So after Lincoln is assassinated, Johnson reneging on his promise to pass the Freedmen's Bureau Bill and the Civil Rights Bill, and then turning around and vetoing them, and radicals feeling incredibly betrayed, and then Johnson coming out and actively running against radicals in the 1866 midterm elections, which backfired on him horribly. And we end up with a massive number of radicals being elected to Congress. I think Lincoln could have navigated those waters a lot better than Johnson did. Johnson just was extraordinarily obtuse. had a lot of trouble reading the political tea leaves around him, and was ingratiating himself so much to Democrats that was alienating himself from the Republican Party. I just don't see Lincoln making those kinds of mistakes.
Well put. Yeah, I think that's really well put.
It seems to me, the fact that he was not just a Democrat, but a Southern Democrat was immediately going to hurt him in the eyes of the Republicans.
He was suspect.
Yeah.
And he did everything he could.
Again, what's weird, and Joe can talk to this as well, is after Lincoln was assassinated, the radicals were actually excited and enthusiastic about Johnson becoming president, because Johnson had articulated a viewpoint that we needed to punish the South and we needed to punish the leaders for the war, and so they were actually overjoyed. And in fact, I think James Ashley was one of the ones who was quoted as saying, "By God, with Johnson in charge, we'll have no trouble running the government now." Those quotes that come back to haunt you later on.
Right, he made some.
Is this a progressive view of the world? That there's as Martin Luther King Jr. said, that the arc of the universe bends toward justice.
Yes, but I would call it providential.
Mm.
I would call it providential, biblical.
Okay. Another question. You earlier spoke of how this speech reflects a spiritual transformation, perhaps, in Lincoln. But Stacy Moses asked, might not this also be a reflection of the suffering of the country in the Civil War? Lincoln had an uncanny empathy and understanding of the feeling and attitude of the country's populace. What do you think about that?
Stacy, I think that's a great question. I see those as related. I definitely think Lincoln is a sensitive, empathetic individual on the one hand, but also he has his steel resolve and steel will that he he has to order hundreds of thousands to their deaths. But as Eric said, I think he sees the suffering around him, he's absorbing it, and it's taking its toll on both him and the country. And I think there is this commiseration, if you will, between the suffering of the country and the suffering of the president that meet in this speech.
All right. Another question. David Cedar asks, the last sentence of the second inaugural address refers to a, quote, "a just and lasting peace," unquote. This is something that struck me as well, being a diplomatic historian. These words, "just and lasting peace," show up again and again. I mean, Wilson used it. A number of American presidents have used it. Now we hear it in the context of the Middle East. Was Lincoln the first to use that precise language?
I mean, as far as I know, he was. I don't know of anybody else who used this language in a speech.
It does seem reminiscent of Washington's farewell address, where he talks about our relation with foreign countries, aside from the entangling alliance bit. But I don't know if I don't think Washington uses that specific phrase, "just and lasting peace." But I think there are parallels between the language.
Go ahead.
No, I'm done.
Eric, were you about to say something?
No, I had just. I think he's right about the parallels to Washington. So I mean, I think it's entirely likely. Lincoln drew inspiration from a host of sources for his speeches. So it would not be uncommon at all for him to be drawing from the speeches of the past.
And I have
that exact phrasing is
right.
One that as far as I know, was Lincoln's.
I have a sneaking suspicion too, and I've been reading quite a bit of Webster. It sounds very Websterian. But I don't know of the specific passage yet.
But one of our viewers is asking if where we can find a copy of that sermon by H.W. Beecher?
That's a good question. I have it. Do you mind if I look at the?
Go ahead.
It's on page 41 of my book.
Okay, there we go. Yeah, you get Joe Fornieri.
Okay. It's in paperback. Abraham Lincoln's Political Faith.
There you go. All right. David Cedar asks, Lincoln's last public address argues against inflexible Reconstruction plans, referring to the Louisiana Plan, but emphasizes that, quote, important principles may and must be inflexible, unquote. Do you think, therefore, that Lincoln's approach to Reconstruction would have allowed for as much flexibility as necessary to achieve essential goals, such as ending slavery, training and educating freedmen, etc.?
Who are these people? We got some smart cookies out there. I love these questions. This is great.
We get only the best at teaching American history.
I love it. Who asked that question?
David Cedar.
It's. I don't see anybody's face.
No. All the questions are coming to me, and I am conveying them. So I could have impressed the heck out of you by claiming it for myself.
No, I love it. Can I take a stab at that, Eric, and then I'll pass it on to you. I think that the question is great, and it shows the person who asked it is wrestling with, I think, one of the key virtues that makes Lincoln great, that defines his statesmanship, and that is prudence or practical wisdom, is classically understood by Aristotle and in particular by St. Thomas Aquinas, in my view. And prudence involves not only a consideration of those universal principles, those inflexible principles that Lincoln speaks about, right? I mean, if there's a moral line that you draw, right? When you cross that line, you've surrendered principle and you become a pragmatist, right? But prudence also considers, of course, the particular circumstances in which those principles are applied. So I think Lincoln would have been governed by the principles of equality, in liberty. The Declaration was his moral compass, but he also would have recognized that politics is the art of the possible, right? Not the ideal. That's where he departs from some of the radical abolitionists whose utopian vision of politics may have undermined the very good that they sought to achieve. And so I think Lincoln would have been not pragmatic, in which everything would have been based on expediency or cost-benefit analysis without regard to enduring principles of moral right, but prudent principle, and apply that principle as much as possible under the circumstances. Very often politics is a matter of achieving as much good, not the perfect good, as possible. I think that would have governed his Reconstruction policy.
Eric, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that entirely. I mean, prudence was the guiding force behind Lincoln's statesmanship. The combination of doing what is best but doing what is necessary, and Lincoln
that's well put too.
Found a way of balancing between the two, and find never losing sight of what is principled, what is right, but at the same time also keeping an eye on what is going to work and what is actually practical and what is possible. I think in terms of flexibility to Reconstruction policy, there's no question Lincoln would have brought a great deal of flexibility to that, but would not have compromised certain fundamental principles.
There was a limit. Yeah, I dislike the term pragmatist, and very often Lincoln is referred to as a pragmatist. When I meet people, it's one of the first things Joe, don't you think Lincoln was a pragmatist, that he really was good as reading the tea leaves, but didn't have any guiding principles, and that fails to understand Lincoln's statesmanship. That he was both principled and practical, hence prudent.
Okay. Billy Gallagher has another question. In the last public address, Lincoln seemed to want Louisiana to be a model for Reconstruction. How many other states in the South were willing to follow this same plan of granting limited voting to blacks? Have we stumped our guest?
Eric, yeah,
I don't know offhand. It's a hard question to answer because there's kind of that counterfactual element there of if the same plan in Louisiana had been implemented in Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, would it have been accepted? Would it have had the same kind of results that it would have had in Louisiana? I don't know. There was a lot about Louisiana that was very particular to Louisiana. And to get into some of the areas of the Deep South and try to implement that kind of plan there, I think there was the potential for much greater resistance, the potential for a lot more intransience from the population. But we do have to kind of remember that this is kind of part of the tragedy of Reconstruction, is that at the end of the war, the South was thoroughly defeated. And I don't just mean that militarily. I mean, they were defeated economically. They were defeated spiritually. They were willing to accept, whatever the terms of defeat that was going to be handed out to them by the North. And so there's this moment, this opportunity where, if we have a coherent policy and can bring it down, we perhaps can make a lot of progress. And instead, we end up with this very disjointed policy, and the South starts to get its back up again, feeling like they're being toyed with, feeling like they're being jerked around and stuff by the different powers that be, and that's one of the things I think contributes to why Reconstruction becomes the mess that it does, is the moment where we sort of had the South on the ropes and willing to accept defeat. We didn't really take advantage of it in that moment, and clearly Lincoln's assassination in that moment and the transition to Johnson and everything plays a big role in a lot of this.
Go ahead. Is there something else?
Just that one of the reasons Louisiana was a model is because the North had taken parts of it early in the war, right? With Farragut's Landing. So remember, the war is still being, it's either, by the time of Lincoln's second inaugural address, that the war is still being fought. So, but you're speaking about his last address, yeah, but shortly afterwards, yep.
There's a follow-up. Didn't they, I'm not entirely sure what's meant by they, just decide in Louisiana that the new government could give voting rights to blacks? It did not immediately grant such rights. At that time, not so many Union states had black voting rights yet either.
Yeah, that's the case. I mean, Massachusetts, I'm trying to think what states. I know Massachusetts had black voting rights. Frederick Douglass tried to drop the property qualification in the state of New York, which had restricted black voting rights. I'm trying to think what other, Maine may have had it. But yeah, I think that is correct. And Lincoln writes, as we know, a private letter to Nathaniel Banks, who's presiding over Reconstruction in Louisiana, and he says that, will he consider giving the franchise to intelligent blacks and black soldiers, those that have fought. Now, we need to keep in mind, prior to the 15th Amendment, that suffrage was a right conferred by the states. We don't like to make I think it's a bogus distinction, but it was a distinction that was well held at the time between inalienable rights in the Declaration, political rights of suffrage, and civil rights of citizenship. And political rights and civil rights were at the discretion of the state governments. So Lincoln could exercise a moral stewardship, but he certainly could not have compelled, without the authorization of an amendment, these states to confer suffrage upon African Americans. It had to be done by their own state governments.
Okay. All right. So far, we haven't brought the first inaugural address into this. So perhaps we could lay the two addresses side by side. Aside from the obvious that one is given before fighting has actually begun, and the second is given when it's about over. What are the most striking differences between these two addresses in terms of emphasis, in terms of how they reflect Lincoln's thinking?
In my view, the first inaugural is much more tailored to the circumstance. I'm not saying that the second inaugural is not, but I think it's much more tailored to the secession crisis. It's highly legalistic, in my view. It provides a refutation of secession point by point. Whereas the second inaugural has this much broader perspective it's more reflecting upon what has happened in these 4 years.
Okay. Eric?
Yeah, I think that's right. We kind of take Frederick Douglass's response to the two speeches as a direction for the differences between them. I mean, Frederick Douglass hated the first inaugural address, and the second one he says this was a sacred effort, which he meant in an obviously complimentary way. The first one was formal, it was legalistic, but I think he had a slightly different purpose in mind, trying to convince these other states from not seceding, trying to convince the states that have seceded to come back into the fold. There's another big difference between the two as well, that the first inaugural was, to my knowledge, the only speech Lincoln delivered in which he solicited a lot of help in writing it. And he consulted members of his cabinet and had a lot of input, a lot of editing help, a lot of people who kind of popped in and made contributions to what he had written. Whereas the second inaugural was all him. Nobody had any idea what he was going to say in that second inaugural address. It was a surprise to just about everybody when he came out and delivered it. And so Lincoln had a very clear sense of what the message was going to be the second time around. Whereas the first time, I think he was struggling to figure out how to structure his arguments and structure his language to be as forceful and compelling, but at the same time as sympathetic and as open as he possibly could.
Is it not also the case that the first inaugural address is very much being directed to individual Southerners and residents of the border states who haven't yet committed themselves to secession? I
think that's the case, yeah, particularly the border states. And Virginia, which hadn't seceded yet.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Virginia's key, mm-hmm. I think, in making that address. I say the second inaugural, this pondering of the divine will and the ultimate meaning of this calamity makes it different than providing a constitutional justification for suppressing the rebellion.
Mm-hmm. All right.
But clearly there's a political intention too. It's not simply a theological speculation. He seeks to bind up the nation. And I think that Lincoln's, we know that Lincoln's sincere here, right? The story about how, he, if Jefferson Davis could get out of the country and sneak away without, getting hanged, Lincoln would wink, approve of it.
Hmm.
And he really believed in extending mercy towards the vanquished.
Okay, that's very interesting. Larry Fata asks, we're in regard to the first inaugural address, I've always been somewhat surprised by Lincoln speaking of the fugitive slave laws somewhat disingenuously. Those laws were being flouted, and most, and certainly Lincoln, must have known that. What's going on here? What might his strategy have been in deliberately mischaracterizing the extent to which the fugitive slave laws were being followed?
He says that he'll uphold the fugitive slave provision, and he's highly criticized for that, right? So he says it, and it can be done as good as the moral sense of the community will allow it, because it's such an odious act, he recognizes, in the North. But unlike Chase and some of the abolitionists in the Republican Party, Lincoln believed he had a constitutional obligation to uphold the fugitive slave provision. However, if you read the first inaugural carefully, after he speaks of his obligation to uphold the Fugitive Slave Act, he then says that there's another passage in Article 4, namely the Privileges and Immunities Clause, and he suggests that he will extend federal protection to free blacks to prevent them from being mistakenly dragged into slavery by the draconian Fugitive Slave Act. So that was a remarkable civil rights speculation at that time, which he actually converted into a policy by having his attorney general grant black citizenship during the war.
And certainly Lincoln has another reason for bringing up the fugitive slave laws. He wants to remind the seceded states that slavery actually becomes less secure once secession takes place, because then no one in the North is going to be obligated to.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
Eric, do you care to add anything on this?
No, I just think it's another example of Lincoln's prudence. Once again, he sort of the adherence to the law, but at the same time finding that principled loophole that's going to allow us to offer something like civil rights protection from blacks, being exploited or manipulated under the Fugitive Slave Act. Again, few politicians could navigate a clear channel between those very difficult options, and Lincoln somehow finds a way.
Yeah, just a point here. I live in Rochester, so I'm only about an hour from the Seward House, and I've been quite interested in Seward the past year. And Seward actually opposed the fugitive slave provision, and when he was governor of New York, he refused to return fugitive slaves back to the South. So this endeared him to abolitionists. It's interesting, though, once he comes in Lincoln's cabinet, he gains the reputation as being much more conservative than, of course, in the Johnson administration. But before the election, I think it's interesting to contrast Lincoln with both Seward and Chase, who are in his cabinet on the fugitive slave provision.
Okay. We are rapidly running out of time. There's one more question I'd like to get to from Ryan Kelly. Does the differences between the two addresses show Lincoln's development from a legal mind, due to his prior experience as a lawyer in the first, to the practical experience that a wartime president would experience and reflect upon in the second? Similar to all other second addresses, we hear a much more mindful inaugural address that is rooted in the experience gained during the president's first term. Is that what we're seeing here?
Yeah, I think that's elegantly put. Yeah, I think there is some of that, but I also think that the occasion of the first inaugural did demand a much more legalistic emphasis, given the South was making the case for claiming that the secession was justified on constitutional and extra-constitutional grounds.
Okay. Eric?
Yeah, I'd add on to that. that I think we also take into account, what Lincoln is trying to accomplish in the second inaugural address, and we've touched on a lot of those themes, but the one theme we haven't touched on, and I think bears at least just a quick remark, is that the second inaugural is, in a certain sense, a kind of refutation of Stephen Douglas's popular sovereignty doctrine. Douglas had made that argument that these complex moral questions, can't really be resolved by an appeal to abstract morality. We can only really resolve them through an appeal to the will of the people, and the people have to decide them for themselves. And one of the things Lincoln demonstrates on a kind of phenomenological basis in the second inaugural address is how wrong that view actually is. There are some things the people, even with the might of the majority against them, can't do because they defy the will of God. And when we defy the will of God, we face divine retribution. We face punishment and judgment. And we now have the experience of the war of proof, not only of the existence of God, but of God's, judgment, of God's punishment on the nation for the sin of slavery.
Yeah, and I think Eric, it's correct to emphasize the nation, its collective culpability, of the entire nation, not just the South. Although the South may be more culpable, he suggests, right? The point about how could we ask a just God whether to take the fruits of the labor from the sweat of thy brow.
All right. Well, we are just about out of time. I want to thank both of our panelists, Joe Fornieri and Eric.
Thank you so much.
As well as to our participants for some really terrific questions. Just a reminder to everyone about the email you will receive with a link for your certificate of participation. If you have enjoyed today's webinar, please consider taking an online graduate course through the Ashbrook Center.
Absolutely.
These are also offered as part of our MAG program. You can find more information about Ashland's online course offerings at teachingamericanhistory.org. And you can help us spread the word about these programs by sharing the archive link, which you will receive by email next week, to your colleagues and on social media. Now, our next Documents in Detail webinar will be February 15th, and this will concern Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham City Jail. Wow. I will be joined on that date by Dr. Lucas Morell of Washington and Lee University and Dr. Peter Myers of the University of Wisconsin at Eau Claire. The recommended readings for that webinar have been posted. So we hope to see you back here on February 15th. A good night to all of you.
Thank you.